Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to SCAMP's second workshop this month. Before we get started, I want to share a couple of quick announcements. One is to remind you about the state's COVID-19 rent relief program. It's up and running. And if you work with residents or know someone who's in need of assistance, please consider referring them to housingiskey.com. It's a great site with a bunch of resources that'll help people who are rent burdened or having a financial issue associated with COVID-19, help them to make their rent payments. Secondly, as our communities continue to navigate through the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that it's really crucial that they have access to support and resources. And we've partnered with the state of California to help provide information you need to continue to stay safer and healthier at work and at home. So this website that's here, saferatwork.covid19.california.gov, has a terrific set of resources that can help folks not only with awareness, but also information about vaccines. And with those announcements out of the way, we're turning to today's workshop, which focuses on planning around local politics to advance affordable housing, investigating how cities can use their 2021 housing element to update and support new development. And our speakers today, we've been working with the order a little bit, so I'm going to get the order out of order probably, but it doesn't matter. The four speakers are really terrific. I think our first speaker is going to be Chris Elmendorf, a professor of law at UC Davis. Following Chris will be Moira O'Neill, senior fellow, research fellow at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley. Then we'll have Tom Pace, the director of community development at the city of Sacramento. And then finally, actually, I may have gotten the order wrong, Sierra Adelano, the chief real estate officer at Skid Row Housing Trust. Skid Row Housing Trust is a long-term SCAMP member, so happy to have them participate today. So I'm going to let the speakers work out the order, but I think I got close. Today's session is going to focus on key elements of a white paper and housing element law basics to understand what it means to implement pro-housing policies and how credible commitments can be adopted. We'll take a deep dive into firsthand perspective from a nonprofit affordable housing developer on political barriers and regulatory constraints that impede development. And lastly, we're going to take a close look at public agencies, a public agency that can give us a perspective on the main obstacles to housing and where the government can exert strong influence. I'll also mention that we're going to do questions and answers. So please utilize the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And when the time comes, I'll be helping to moderate the Q&A portion of the conversation. And I think that's sufficient setup. So I'm pleased to introduce our first two speakers, Chris and Moira, who will open up our discussion.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, great. Well, thanks so much. It's really great to be here today. I want to try to open this session by just giving a big picture overview of the housing element law and how it's evolved fairly dramatically between the fifth and the sixth cycles. The sixth cycle is what we are embarking on now. And then I'll segue from that overview into a discussion of why I think the housing element update provides a somewhat unusual opportunity for housing advocacy at the municipal level, a setting in which that advocacy can be more effective than it is in many other occasions. Okay, so the housing element law in its current form dates to 1980. It actually goes all the way back to the 60s, but more or less the current framework dates to 1980. And you'll notice in this figure, which is from the Legislative Analyst, something dramatic happened in California between 1970 and 1980. These are median home prices in California versus the nation. And California is a nice place to live, and perhaps not unexpectedly, it's always been a little bit more expensive of a place to live. But between 1970 and 1980, California went from being a little bit more expensive to dramatically more expensive, almost twice as expensive as the rest of the country. And if anything, the situation has only gotten worse since then. And in 1980, the legislature adopted the RHNA, or Housing Element Framework, as it is variously called. So how does it work? Well, every 8 years, the state projects what it calls regional housing need for each of 20 regions. Then regional councils of governments, which are like coalitions or of cities and counties, they band together and they allocate their region's need as determined by the state to cities and counties within the region. This number that is allocated to each jurisdiction is called its RHNA, for Regional Housing Needs Allocation or Assessment. And that RHNA is divided into 4 different income categories: housing for very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income households. Cities and counties then adopt what's called the housing element of their general plan. And with that housing element, they include an inventory of sites in which they say, look, using these sites with suitable zoning, we can accommodate our share of the region's housing need. And then finally, if the zoning is not suitable at the time the housing element is adopted, the city must rezone within 3 years. And that rezoning, if it's for the lower income portion of need, generally must be accommodated on sites that are zoned to allow at least 30 dwelling units per acre in urban areas. Okay, but as you can see from the, at least the pattern of prices, this framework, which was adopted in 1980, hasn't panned out that well. So what's changed? Well, between the 5th and the 6th cycle, the 6th cycle being the cycle we are embarking on now, the legislature passed several laws which have resulted in much larger housing targets, and within regions, a much proportionally greater allocation of the region's target to expensive cities, high price locations. And I've included bill names with hyperlinks in the slides. If you're interested in digging deeper, I think the slides will be posted afterwards. But there's hyperlinks here if you want to dig into the details. I'm also happy to talk more in the Q&A. So housing targets in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles area are 2 to 3 times larger than in the previous cycle. And then for some cities, 10 times larger. So a second change is there's more realism about what is actually the capacity of a site to accommodate some portion of the region's share of housing need, or the city's share of the region's housing need. And the most important idea that is now part of the Department of Housing and Community Development's guidance to cities is that they should take some account of the likelihood of additional development within the planning period. It's not clear how cities are supposed to be doing this, and the implementation so far, I would say, has been not great. But this is a really important idea, because during previous cycles, cities would just zone for housing, and then they would top off that zoning with a whole bunch of fees or other procedural requirements, or they would cite the housing in places where there were existing uses that made the housing infeasible to develop. And so the effect of zoning was not necessarily to produce the housing. But now, again, cities are supposed to make some assessment of how likely the sites are to be developed as part of their assessment of capacity. Third, cities have a new duty to affirmatively further fair housing. This means, again, the precise content of this commitment is a little uncertain, but the basic idea is that a housing elements plan or program should be desegregatory. Sorry, that's a mouthful. Should work affirmatively to undo historic patterns of racial and socioeconomic segregation and exclusion. And then finally, it's gotten harder, a lot harder for cities to deny housing projects that comply with the general plan and zoning. Previously, cities would zone on paper for housing, but then they'd have all kinds of other tools with which they could deny a project that complied with the zoning. And they still have a lot of tools with which to delay projects, but it's gotten a lot harder and riskier to deny projects outright. Okay, so what makes this moment, this adoption of housing elements, so auspicious for pro-housing advocates? I would emphasize 4 points. First, the groups that normally oppose rezoning or planning for additional housing or additional density, they have an incentive to compromise when it comes to the housing element. The threat of derailing a housing element through CEQA litigation or through other forms of opposition is less than the threat of derailing most other forms of pro-housing action at the local level. And the reason is that if a city is out of compliance with the housing element law, it appears that that city actually forfeits its authority to deny 20% low income or 100% moderate income projects on the basis of the city's zoning code or general plan. In other words, the city could still deny the project if it would violate some objective health or safety standard, but the city can't say to the developer, your project is too tall, it includes too many units, it doesn't comply with local zoning. And this provision of state law hasn't really been put to the test yet, but it's something that worries cities a lot, and I think is worrying NIMBY groups a lot. So there's an opportunity to pass a housing element that's pretty good that might not otherwise exist, because the consequences of not enacting the housing element are, from a NIMBY's perspective or from a city attorney's perspective, are not good. Second, the housing element as a component of the general plan takes precedence over other local ordinances or regulations. So if there's a conflict between the housing element and the city's zoning or city's rezoning of a site, that is a basis for invalidating the rezoning and indeed approving projects that conform to the housing element. So a deal that is essentially codified in or categorized as an important part of the housing element becomes a deal that's hard to undo, except with housing element amendments. And those have to be submitted to HCD, the State Housing Department, for review before being adopted. Third, while most rezoning at the city level happens on a piecemeal site-by-site basis, or maybe with neighborhood level plans, those neighborhood level decisions tend to foreground neighborhood interests, whereas the housing element update foregrounds citywide and regional interests, and so forces cities to confront trade-offs with, well, if we're not going to allow housing here, we're going to have to allow it somewhere else. And that trade-off is normally missing from most municipal, or that attention to trade-offs is normally missing from most municipal policymaking over land use. And then finally, what housing elements actually accomplish depends a lot on local knowledge. And so people who know their community well have an opportunity not only to lobby their city council, but also to submit information and comments to the state housing agency, HCD, which reviews housing elements. And there are therefore multiple different avenues of political influence. Even if you're not able to persuade your city council to adopt a great housing element, if you can show that it's really bad in some important way, maybe you get one or two members of the city council to vote against the housing element, and then that emboldens the state oversight agency to reject the housing element or insist on substantial strengthening. So that just about wraps up my overview for the time being, and happy to discuss further these ideas during the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists. Thanks.
So I am coordinating with others around the slides, so I'll just wait for the slides that I've prepared to come up on the screen. Thank you. So I am going to speak a little bit to what colleagues and I have learned about existing regulation, land use regulation, and its potential or actual impact on affordable development. And broadly, what I'm engaging with here is a larger study that is called the Comprehensive Assessment of Land Use Entitlements, that's referring to work to really understand how regulations work together and individually to influence housing development patterns of dense housing, so 5 or more units of housing. And today I'm going to focus quite a bit, though, on specifically deed-restricted affordable development. So the work involves 2 components of land use regulation, looking at density and use provisions in a group of jurisdictions across the state of California, and then also looking at the process component of law as it is applied to actual proposed developments of 5 or more units of housing in the state, in the cities that we studied. And among those cities, I'm going to really focus quite a bit on 2 to sort of illustrate what we're learning in relationship to potential constraints around the development of housing or possible opportunities. So moving to the next slide. This broadly is one of the ways I'm describing some of the jurisdictions that we've studied. This is describing what we've learned about density and use provisions within this jurisdiction. So this is before seeing law applied to any proposed development. But if we're thinking about density, trying to get multifamily housing built, and in particular, if we're thinking about affordable development, we want to understand how much land area that's zoned within a jurisdiction is actually zoned for all income levels. And we use the state default standard that's found in housing element law, the 30 dwelling units per acre for urban jurisdictions, and all of these on our screen qualified for that default standard, to explore the amount of land area that's made available in the first instance for the development of housing for all income levels. And I'm highlighting here one of the cities, San Diego, as providing an example of the amount of land area that is not only meeting that 30 DU per acre threshold, but is also located in the highest resource land areas using the TCAC metric. And that's referring to the mapping tool that defines opportunity across multiple dimensions of opportunity for the purposes of low income housing tax credits. So we use that as another measurement tool to explore available use and density for all income levels in the first instance. And you can see there's a significant contrast between the amount of land area that is available for all income levels in higher opportunity areas relative to the amount of land area in the same area that's for single family. You can also see that we've layered in another acronym, and that's the HQTA, the high quality transit area. In a sense, we're sort of intersecting those 2 measurement tools, those 2 mapping tools at the same time, to really try to tease out how much land area jurisdiction is making available for ideally affordable development. So another way to sort of explore this is to use visuals to show you the mapping tools that we began with. So if we go to the next slide, you can see visually on the map where we have just labeled with color coding the amount of land area in the jurisdiction that is made available for all income levels versus the amount of land area that is made available for single family. So the complexity here, of course, is that we can't fully answer every question as to why certain land area is low density, single family, but we can, with additional mapping tools, start to explore the potential implications in terms of what the historical land use policy might have been, as well as current opportunities. So if we could go to the next slide. What we see here is we're layering in redlining to sort of understand the trends in terms of existing density. And while there's still a substantial amount of land area that was once redlined in San Diego that is low density, we also see that much of the actual permissive, what we describe as permissive zoning, the zoning that is made available for all income levels, also overwhelmingly is in formerly redlined areas, if in fact it was within the boundaries where redlining occurred. One of the challenges with using historical analysis is that jurisdictional boundaries shift and change. And so redlining maps don't necessarily line up with current jurisdictional boundaries. But if we go to the next slide, we now sort of explore these zoning categories in relationship to opportunity. So this is how we get to some of those calculations I showed on that first table. This is how we determine exactly how much of the land area is made available for all income levels in relationship to opportunity. Now I'm going to contrast this with a really different jurisdiction, San Francisco. If we could go to the next slide. San Francisco, using the historical analysis, we can see the trend where most of San Francisco, you can just see visually, if you recall from the table, has much more land area made available for all income levels, just as a percentage of its total zone land area. But notably, most of that land area is in formerly redlined areas or in a former industrial area that's adjacent to formerly redlined areas. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that while some of that land area is also distributed in higher opportunity areas, quite a bit of it is also distributed in the lower resource areas using the TCAC maps. But density and use provisions are only one potential constraint on the ability to develop multifamily housing and specifically affordable housing. Process provides another potential constraint. So if we can go to the next slide, one of the things that we did is we looked very thoroughly at what all of the planning and zoning allowed for in terms of process. So while we didn't explore fees, which is something else that Chris mentioned, we did capture the other dimension of regulation, not just density and use provisions, but what does a jurisdiction require a proposed development to navigate to get to an approval? Does it allow for as of right or a ministerial process where you can approach the building department directly to get the right to build, or do you have to navigate entitlement in order to get to the building department? And so what we found, interestingly, is that 4 of our jurisdictions did provide ministerial processes for dense development. And we describe that again as 5 or more units of housing associated either through mixed use or residential development. But we actually only found observations of the application of a ministerial process in 1 of our study jurisdictions, and that was Los Angeles. In the other 3, we were unable to confirm that there were any developments that moved through a ministerial process. So San Diego, in fact, allows for as of right to whatever the underlying density and use provisions would allow if other restrictions don't move a proposed development outside of that process. But we couldn't confirm any observations of that, whereas we could in the Los Angeles context. So that can have other implications or create more constraints around proposed development. So even, for example, in a jurisdiction that might have a lot of land area available for proposed dense development and affordable development, process requirements may constrain the amount that might make its way through. So if we could go to the next slide, we sort of illustrate this by showing you median timeframes. This is specifically for multifamily development, and that multifamily development that we could describe as code compliant, that conforms to all underlying zoning and planning designations. So there's no ask for a conditional use permit. There's no request for a variance or a deviation or an exception of any kind. And these are the median timeframes. And so in this slide, I've highlighted San Francisco to illustrate the complexity of how the different regulations can operate. So on the one hand, San Francisco was unique among our jurisdictions in how much land area it made available for all income levels. But it's also unique among our jurisdictions in how long it takes to navigate an entitlement. So it creates quite a bit of uncertainty around the development process, and it increases the holding time for the developer, which has significant implications even for 100% deed of restricted affordable development, which, while my slides don't show this, is the most favored development in the jurisdiction. In other words, we saw the shortest timelines for 100% affordable development in San Francisco, and yet they were still far outside of a year for entitlement. They were quite long. In fact, they were closer to the 16-month timeline you see in Mountain View. And in general, though, San Francisco just is so far beyond the timeframes that we see in other jurisdictions. So together, these can create substantial constraints, but even if a jurisdiction is, for example, rezoning land area to address the need for more land for multifamily, the process requirements can get in the way of seeing that realized. Another thing to consider is that the jurisdictions we're studying, all of them for the most part, rely heavily on either density bonus, density incentives, or inclusionary mechanisms to increase their deed restricted affordable development, which is why how process treats multifamily development is pretty critical to also seeing increased deed restricted affordable. So that's two ways we can explore broadly whether or not regulation might be posing an obstacle, either one part of regulation or an operation with another part of regulation. Another thing we can do with our data is to explore actual citing of deed restricted affordable in relationship to opportunity. In other words, how much did the jurisdiction approve within the study period that we had? So we examined all approvals that were issued by a jurisdiction in 2014, 2015, 2016, or 2017. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm showing you here the number of units that are deed restricted affordable and that were approved in San Diego during that study period. They were approved in one of those years, and how those units were distributed in relationship to opportunity. And we can see here, if the jurisdiction were studying this issue, to determine whether or not its ordinances were potentially promoting fair housing goals, there are two open questions. One might be, maybe it's deliberate policy to have the higher number of units in the high segregation and poverty and low resource area if in fact the higher need is there. But given the fact that San Diego's land area, tends not to, there's not much that's both high quality transit area and also made available for all income levels, but then there's quite a bit that's high quality transit area and single family only. Maybe they would want to revisit their regulatory environment to see if the distribution of units might have some relationship to that, or they may just even acknowledge that at present, the distribution of units may not promote fair housing goals because it may not promote income integration, if that's the aim. And then we can go to the last slide, which illustrates the San Francisco context. And I think both of these cities are interesting to contrast, not just because San Francisco, as you can see, has so few units that are cited in higher and high resource areas. And that's really interesting given how much land area is actually in those opportunity areas. I think it's also interesting because both jurisdictions, in fact, create a lot of incentives to try to increase deed restricted affordable development. In other words, both jurisdictions have inclusionary mechanisms, and San Diego offers more incentives to try to accelerate process. San Francisco definitely treats affordable development better than it treats market rate or mixed income development in terms of process timelines. And yet we still see these outcomes. And in this case, this would also invite the question of whether this is consistent with their policy objectives, if this is the desire to see such an overwhelmingly greater number of deed restricted affordable units in the lower opportunity area relative to the higher opportunity area, or if there's a desire to see an increased number of units in the higher opportunity area. And probably the larger question is what could be done to just increase overall the amount of affordability within the jurisdictions. So that closes out what I'm going to share, and I'm happy to answer any questions from our data that might come up.
Sierra, you're on mute.
So sorry about that. Good afternoon. I'd like to start off my overview of developers firsthand and how we can promote more affordable housing with a quote from the white paper. And that states the cities would adopt better land use policies if they could establish a procedural framework for hashing out citywide deals. The prospect of a citywide deal would motivate pro-housing groups to engage. The local stakes for the neighborhood would be less clear-cut than when specific project is on the line. The housing element is the ideal instrument for a citywide deal. It's a citywide plan. It's adopted following the assessment of the citywide and regional needs and enables the city to make credible commitments going forward. I wanted to start with that because I think the key word really here is credible. As an affordable housing developer, we embark on an envision with each project with partners, cities, counties, and states, and private partners to bring each project to fruition. The average time that it takes to start a construction from the start of initial vision to the purchase of the land is about 3 to 5 years. Not every project even makes it to the finish line. And as there's constraints in funding, cost escalations that render the project infeasible. Project takes millions of dollars of pre-development costs in order to obtain the funding requirements to even start construction. And developers take a risk each time. Risk is a key in this because I think that there's an alignment between risk and reward when you're looking at development in general. And I think that this is where we need to work on realignment and definitely could be done on reassessing the housing plan. I think the risk is always on the affordable housing development community and not in the cities in which have the requirements for the funding. The misalignment in this risk is also misalignment in responsibility. The development of the comprehensive citywide plan would realign the risk and ensure that cities are motivated to see a pipeline of projects that have alignment with the housing goals that they set forth. Currently, that's not the way things are. Essentially, the affordable housing developer would take on the role as the executor of the plan, which could provide lower costs via efficiency and shortened timelines. The other thing I wanted to highlight is one of the biggest issues, Chris also presented this, is NIMBYism. As a developer, we take on huge risk with each project that we present, especially for my organization. Looking at permanent supportive housing specifically, with a name like Skid Row Housing Trust, I can tell you firsthand that we were not received with a warm welcome in most neighborhoods. Often developers like ours take on enormous costs and time and energy to get projects approved. I applaud a recommendation of pro-housing, that the thought that we could incentivize cities and neighborhoods to approve such projects as PSH in their neighborhood is something that would enable the developments to move forward and create more density in projects to make it feasible. I can tell you firsthand, we had a project that we took for city approval, neighborhood approval, probably about a year before COVID hit. And it was one of, I've been in the industry for a lot of years. I've been to a lot of these planning sessions in which we seek neighborhood approval and approval from planning. And I've dealt with NIMBYism my entire career. And we often would have, neighborhoods, so you either have a huge neighborhood support, or depending on the affordable development, or you have people that just need to be educated on homelessness or affordable housing in general. I know on this particular project, we spent many, many hours working with meeting after meeting with the neighborhood in general, just educating them on really what homelessness even looked like in their neighborhood. I think they had a vision that we were bringing, especially given our name, that we were going to bring Skid Row to their neighborhood, and that we weren't going to house the individuals in their local area. It was interesting because most of the neighborhood council meetings that we sat in on, we were the last group to speak, and all of their meetings started with complaints from city constituents and from residents of the neighborhood complaining about the number of homeless that they were seeing in their area. Yet when it came time to approve our project, they didn't want to approve a permanent supportive housing project in their neighborhood. They wanted the problem to go away, but they didn't want to take necessarily responsibility for housing them as neighbors. And the one thing that we try to keep educating them on is these are already your neighbors. They're just not in a house, and everybody deserves housing. And I think that to the extent that we could use the updating housing element within cities to allow for by right and allow for less of the NIMBYism to start the project off in a negative light with neighborhoods, I think is something that I definitely applaud and something that I would ask cities to approve and include in their plans as much as possible. One of the other political barriers that the last and final point that I want to touch on that we deal with is, as affordable housing developer, we often work with competing goals with the city, the county, and the state with respect to financing requirements. This is something that slows down the ability to move projects forward. It adds additional costs onto the projects because it's really just not aligned. And this goes back to the misalignment of responsibility and risk. And one city, a city or a county may ask for additional, and I'll use something very basic as a storage in a closet, and they will add for additional costs to be added onto the project because it's something that they deem important to them and to their constituents, and then it does not align with creating housing that's affordable, creating more housing essentially if we're adding additional cost on. So I think to the extent that we could work on getting financing requirements from each one of the funders, city, state, and county, to align to the project, to the citywide goals, is something that we'd like to see move forward so that we can create more housing. I think that there's also a misalignment with funding sources in general and application timelines. That's something that could be improved on if we could line up the funding in a citywide plan that could incorporate the timelines so that they are stacked kind of together, or maybe even the city could package entire financing packages together for developers to where it'd be one set, application for a project to move forward rather than projects sitting on conveyor belts for an extended amount of time. And I would just conclude with, these are some of the political barriers that we face as a developer in our experience, and that we look forward to see some of these updating plans, essentially aligning risk with rewards and motivating cities to develop more affordable housing. Thank you.
Thanks, Sierra. Good afternoon, everybody. Bear with me one moment while I share my screen. All right, I think you should be able to see my screen now. Someone can call out to me if that's not the case. Otherwise, I'll assume it is. All right, my outline, I'd like to share a few points about, from the city of Sacramento's perspective, about the obstacles to housing production, how the housing element can help, a little bit about our regional housing needs allocation and our sites inventory and the methodology we use to prepare that. And then a couple of key points from our current housing element update that relate to how we're streamlining housing and expanding housing choice in our traditional neighborhoods. So in terms of some of the major obstacles to housing production, there are many, but local government doesn't have complete control over all of them. But the two key areas I believe that local government can be most helpful to help promote housing production are land use and zoning, larger sort of permit process as well, and infrastructure. Looking at how the housing element can help, getting back to that sort of land use and zoning piece, one of the key parts of the housing element is to ensure that each jurisdiction has an adequate land inventory and zoning. And so in the city of Sacramento, we have a combination of large greenfield areas that can be developed out at the edge of the city, but increasingly we see more development in infill areas. And our infill areas have a combination of sites. There may be some small vacant sites, but many times the sites are already developed to some degree. Perhaps it's possible to add housing on a portion of the site that's not built on, or it may be possible to reuse the site or redevelop the site. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we do that analysis in a moment. It's also important to have a good analysis of constraints. We need to look at what roadblocks local governments put in the way of housing production, making sure that our permit processing procedures are as efficient as possible, that our fees are as low as possible, that our development standards are pro-housing development standards, and that we have adequate infrastructure to support the housing that we need. And of course, it's important that we have the right goals, policies, and implementation programs in our housing element. And those can then form a binding commitment to ensure that we provide adequate housing sites, that we remove those constraints, and that we increase the number and types of housing units throughout the city. So as was mentioned earlier, the requirement in the current cycle has greatly increased the amount of housing allocation that many of our communities in California have to plan for. In our case, it's an 89% increase over the last cycle. And that means that we've gone from having to produce about 3,000 units a year in total to now needing to produce about 5,700 units a year. Now, in terms of having some realistic assumptions for our sites inventory, first of all, we look at the income level, and that is correlated to the zoning. As was mentioned previously, higher density sites are deemed to be sites that are available for all income levels and are appropriate for lower income housing. And so then we look at where the vacant and underutilized parcels are. And then we make a series of assumptions about the feasibility of a site and about how realistic these sites are for development. And so rather than assuming 100% of the zoned capacity of each of these sites will develop during the housing planning period, we assume a maximum of 80 to 90% of that density will develop on each of those sites. And then we take an additional lens and look at the realistic capacity of each of these sites by further tailoring that downward based on the degree to which the site has vacant space where housing can be built, the likelihood of redevelopment of the site. And that can be based on the availability of existing infrastructure and the capacity of that infrastructure. It can also take into account market conditions and market demand to develop housing in the area. And so all of these factors help us to weed out sites that might look on paper like they could count towards the housing element, but aren't realistic sites. We don't want to have an inventory of unrealistic sites submitted to the state saying, see, we meet the requirements with this group of unrealistic, undevelopable sites. No, we want to see sites that we really do believe can be developed during the 8-year cycle and that have adequate infrastructure, that are likely to redevelop if they are existing developed sites, or if they're vacant, that they're of the right size and shape and configuration and location where they can be developed with housing on them. So we apply this analysis and we come up with our inventory. And so that inventory resulted, fortunately for us this time, it's looking like we have plenty of sites to meet our obligation. And it's important that we have a surplus, particularly for lower income units and maybe to some extent for moderate income units, because often these are sites that are either in residential zones that allow some non-residential uses, such as churches and schools and parks. And in which case, if any one of those non-residential uses is developed, then some of those sites are no longer available. We don't have a site that gets developed as a park is no longer available as a housing site. So we need to make sure we have extra sites in addition to the bare minimum. And then, of course, we do have mixed use sites that may develop with non-residential uses. So it is important to have that surplus. However, having enough sites isn't the same as producing enough units. And as I mentioned earlier, we needed to be building about 3,000 units a year for the last 8 years. And we only really got close or exceeded that in 3 of those years, 2017, 2019, and 2020. And for most of the years in the early part of the cycle, we were in the Great Recession, and there were a lot of other reasons why housing wasn't being developed. But this doesn't really bode well for the next cycle, where we know that we not only have to, meet the requirements that we had in the last cycle, we have to exceed them and almost double the number of units that we're going to see citywide being developed each year. So some of the challenges in this RHNA process that I just wanted to point out, the state does have some conflicting policy objectives, which can make things difficult. On the one hand, the state wants local governments to ensure that the RHNA goals are met and that housing production is facilitated, but the state also passes numerous laws and regulations that can add cost and difficulty for housing production, including the ever increasing building code requirements that get added every 3 years. Of course, the California Environmental Quality Act can be a challenge. And then this may be a little bit controversial, but I wanted to just briefly touch on affirmatively furthering fair housing and the goal to see more low-income housing built in high opportunity areas. This may be challenging because land is typically a higher cost in high opportunity areas, and it's more affordable in those lower opportunity areas. And so how do we get more housing built if we're increasing the costs of that housing? So I think there's a really important goal there, but it is a challenge. And then, of course, funding is a challenge. And we believe that jurisdictions like ours that have very large RHNA allocations should have equally proportionately large allocations of funding to help subsidize affordable housing. I wanted to point out one of the programs that we put in place to help facilitate production of multi-unit housing, and that is our ministerial approval of infill housing. The state process went into effect about 3 years ago, and we didn't really see any projects under SB 35 come across our desk until the last year. And we've seen 3 of those projects come in. But in the last 7 months, since the city adopted a local ministerial approval process, which is available for projects that contain duplex and multi-unit dwellings of 2 to 200 units and meet a number of other criteria. If they meet all of those criteria, they can be approved ministerially. And we've had 8 of those projects with a total of 800 units. And a substantial number of them have been affordable units. And then when we add in some pending applications we have, I'm pleased to say that the overwhelming majority of the units under our ministerial program are affordable units. So I think it's in the very short time that we've seen these applications coming into Sacramento, just in the last 7 to 12 months, we've had some good success here, and the affordable housing developers are really taking advantage of this program. I also want to talk about our plan to allow duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes in our single family neighborhoods. And there are a number of reasons for this, but we think it's important to increase the total supply of housing in our community and the number of sites where housing can be built, and also to counter discriminatory practices that created barriers to home ownership and wealth building for minority families through zoning practices. And one thing that that you can note, if you look at a map of the city of Sacramento, a land use map, the yellow areas on the map are our low density single family neighborhoods where only one house per lot is allowed. And so that's, as you can see on the map, that's a lot of the city. That's most of the residential areas. And this has been used since the 1920s, often to achieve racial and socioeconomic segregation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map for Sacramento is on the left in this image. And you can see that the green and blue areas were deemed to be the good areas to build housing. Those were the whitest neighborhoods. And the red and yellow areas were the neighborhoods with the largest numbers of people of color and apartments and other undesirable land uses in them. And as we look today at many of the residential neighborhoods in our city, we can see that many tracts of residential development were laid out with restrictive covenants. And that's the diagram on the right that shows many of the census tracts that were developed with racially restrictive covenants. And those are also areas that are largely zoned for single family development. Another reason that we want to allow a greater variety of housing types in our traditional neighborhoods is sustainability. By doing this, we can increase the number of people who can have access to the existing amenities that are already in those neighborhoods. There'll be more people living there to support our existing businesses, which especially now are really struggling. And of course, it allows us to more efficiently deliver city services and infrastructure by taking advantage of those existing investments that we've already made in public transit and other facilities. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Sierra, Moira, Chris, way to go, everybody. We've had a fairly robust discussion in the chat and the question and answers sections here. I'm going to do my best to make sure that we field all the questions. Certainly, if you feel like we haven't addressed your question appropriately, please feel free to put it in the Q&A section or in the chat. I saw one earlier that asked about whether we would be providing the PowerPoint presentations, and the answer to that is yes. You'll get a follow-up email that has not only the presentation materials, but also a survey. So we would just kindly request that you take a minute to fill out the short survey to help guide our further programming and let us know how we did today. Some of these things have been kind of responded to in turn. So I'm going to start at what I see as the top question in the Q&A section, which talks about, and this might be coming to you, Sierra, this question around, will TCAC ever stop subsidy requirements to obtain 9% tax credits? Essentially saying that this is one of the reasons why costs have increased. And you can only add subsidy to the construction cost, which means it does not create more housing as it was intended. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about the current TCAC regulations and 9% subsidy requirements.
Yeah, I can say that it's a challenge for us as developers. I agree with you. I hope that is something that gets changed. I don't think it's anything proposed in the next round of regulation changes. I hope that it's something that comes down the pipeline later, but I agree with you that it's something that we need to be looking out for and propose to have changes in the future. I wish I had a better answer than that.
Well, I'll tell you what, we could send you up there, you could run the agency, and we'd be happy for that. I'm going to leave this one open to whoever wants to jump in on about the question of how do we define high opportunity areas?
So I am not constructing that measurement, but I can put in the question. I'll direct you to the link to the mapping tool. There's actually a report that accompanies the mapping tool. I use the measurement from TCAC, and it crosses over multiple dimensions of opportunity related to income levels, concentration, poverty in a census tract, educational attainment within the area, a whole host of factors. I think there are about 9 different dimensions that they explore, and it's primarily been done in the most recent years by the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. And I can, like I said, I can incorporate some links to the relevant report that defines opportunity and explains how they come up with those those tools. And then there are 5 classifications. And so I grouped highest opportunity and high opportunity to just sort of, be able to look at the total land area that was zoned for all income levels within that measurement tool.
Terrific, Moira. Thank you. I don't want to put you on the spot, Tom, but I think this next one's coming your way about cities and upzoning. So it says cities are willing to upzone commercial, mixed use, and multifamily zones and create incentive programs. But what city is realistically willing to touch the single family zones? This needs to be addressed by the state because very few cities have engaged YIMBY groups, but all cities have engaged single family owners that are not willing to change no matter how much work is done with them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sacramento is one of those cities that is willing to do this. In fact, our council has taken an action to give us direction as we're updating our general plan to allow those missing middle housing types in the single family neighborhoods. We do have active engaged YIMBY groups in Sacramento as well. And there is also currently legislation underway that would make changes to the laws that would facilitate, more units per lot in areas that are currently zoned for single family.
Yeah, terrific. It's sort of happening in different places in different ways, but definitely more of a gathering attention. And I actually don't dispute the question, which is maybe we need some sort of intervention at the high level, sort of like this whole housing element concept that we're talking about is similar, right? In that the state just sort of said, okay, if we're not doing what we need to do at the local level, we're going to supersede those land use powers and create some incentives. Chris, I think this one's coming to you, bring this one to you. Can you talk a little bit about how the targeting of income levels has changed in this cycle to produce more housing for very low income or low income folks, households, and how do you define affordable? Is it rent at 30% of income?
So I believe the affordable definition is rent at 30% of income. The two things that have changed most substantially that are specific to sites for designated as suitable for lower income households are first, that cities have to provide a much more exhaustive analysis to show that those sites are actually realistic to develop during the planning period. If the city is relying on non-vacant sites for more than half of its total low-income RHNA, which will be true of most cities, I think, in urbanized areas, the city has to show that existing uses are likely to be discontinued during the planning period. So more upfront analysis about the developability of those sites, or equivalently their capacity for housing during the planning period. And then second, there's a state law called no net loss, which has been on the books forever. And essentially it says if at any point during the planning period, a city's remaining capacity in its housing element inventory falls below the city's remaining share of its RHNA, the city has to, within 6 months, provide additional capacity through rezoning or through housing element amendments that identify additional sites. And that no net loss law went unenforced because HCD had no information about what was actually happening on the housing element inventory sites, be it rezoning or be it development or anything else. But now there are two big changes. One, the housing element inventory has to include assessor parcel numbers for each site, and those inventories have to be submitted in electronic form, and annual reports to HCD on development and rezonings also have to include the assessor parcel number for each parcel. So this will give HCD information with which, in theory, it can monitor compliance with no net loss. Second, no net loss has been redefined to mean no net loss by income category. So if a city approves, let's say, a 90% market rate project on a site that was designated as suitable for lower income housing, that will be reducing the city's share of its low income RHNA by only a small amount, but reducing the city's share of its low income site capacity by a larger amount. And so could trigger a duty to rezone for additional capacity. And it's really unclear right now how those new net loss provisions are going to play out. They may turn out to be terrific and really induce cities to provide a lot more rezoning during the planning period, or they may backfire and induce cities not to approve projects, period, to do or to delay projects for as long as they possibly can on those sites that are designated as suitable for lower income housing.
Yeah, and in Sacramento, we've definitely encountered this. That's why I mentioned when I went over the numbers in my slideshow that we wanted to have extra sites to make sure we have a buffer, because we know that not only will non-residential uses get developed on some of these sites where that's allowed by the zoning, but also if we're banking on a site for lower income housing and a higher income project goes in there, because high density doesn't necessarily mean low income nowadays. We're seeing greater demand for market rate high density housing, and so we have to have extra sites for those.
Tom, while I'm looking at you, I was noticing with interest the slide on the ministerial approval for affordable. And you may have mentioned it, and I may have missed it, but is that ministerial approval for 100% affordable, or is it some percentage of affordable?
So we have two processes. There's the state mandated SB 35 process, and that one has, I think it's a 20% affordable requirement for projects with more than 10 units. And not very many, we haven't had a lot of interest in that particular path, but for some reason, because I think frankly, that law also has prevailing wage requirements and some other strings tied to it that make it difficult for some affordable housing developers to comply. So we created a local version of a ministerial process. It does not have an affordability requirement. So it's available to 100% market rate projects and 100% affordable projects and everything in between. But I was very pleased to see that at least so far in the first 7 months, more than half the units that came out of that program have been affordable units without a mandate. But I think it's because, we have some savvy affordable housing developers here, and they've gone through the heartaches that Sierra was talking about, and they really want to avoid the NIMBY aspect. And so they're taking advantage of this, and they're passing the word amongst themselves. Hey, you need to use the city's ministerial process.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. I was noticing earlier, and I'm not sure where the question went, and maybe somebody answered it, but I was kind of intrigued by it. It sounded like it was somebody from Santa Monica asking the question around inclusionary, essentially saying that if you target it at either a too high, this is by memory, so I may get it wrong, but either at too high of a level as a percentage of the total developments as affordable, or too low income level as a percentage of affordable, you impact the feasibility. I just wonder if feasibility of the overall deal. I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts about experiences with inclusionary policies and how the income ratios work with respect to feasibility.
Yes, if we're relying on a market rate project to produce a certain number of affordable units, then the details of how the program is structured are very important, because if the inclusionary program creates a significant additional cost that has to be spread over the remaining market rate units. So let's say you have a 20% inclusionary requirement. So 80% of the units are market rate, 20% are affordable. But if the 80% of the units have to bear the cost of subsidizing the remaining 20%, then that cost gets added to the market rate units, and it can push those market rate unit costs up above moderate income levels and into the luxury housing level only. And when construction costs are high, when land costs are high, and so forth, unit costs are high no matter what. And so this is a real conundrum that we're, looking at in Sacramento. We have a policy to kind of relook at our policies and do a study, an economic study, to really figure out what might be a feasible path forward.
Can I jump in on this too? I think this is going to be like the big issue over the next period of time, because there are these new state laws that are going to require cities to rezone for a lot more multifamily housing, and there's cities that don't want that housing. And the one thing that they can do that looks like they're complying on paper but keeps the housing from being built is setting inclusionary requirements that no developer, unless they have huge public subsidies, can comply with. So South Pasadena has been talking about, setting a new standard for inclusionary requirements. And if you look at the rest of what's come out of their draft housing element process, I think it's pretty clear what their goal is. Even San Francisco, which I think of as a city that's, it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of housing policy, but when they upped their inclusionary requirements most recently, their study was premised on, their feasibility study was premised on the market rent of a 1-bedroom apartment. I might have this wrong, but it was something like the market rent of a 1-bedroom apartment increasing over 10 years to $5,000 a month. I could be a little bit off on that, but basically they were assuming that the city was going to become even more prohibitively expensive. And if that happens, then we can have this incredibly high inclusionary requirement without deterring development. But it so happens that over the past year, rents have fallen 17%, 20% in San Francisco, and nobody's building any market rate housing now. So the effect of the inclusionary requirement is, San Francisco, most expensive housing market in California, is seeing virtually no market rate construction.
Yeah, these it's always interesting to have these conversations around sort of what's possible and what's not possible, because I play out both in the what I'll call the academic world, the sort of empirical world where studies happen, and then there's the political world where if you're imposing anything, the sky is falling, it's never going to work ever, and you don't really know until you actually do the thing. So I appreciate that cautionary. I'm noticing somebody was asking if we were going to be able to send the comments, and so this is a technical question for the system. I'm told that the system doesn't record chat, but it does keep the record of the Q&A. So the Q&A will be included in the recording materials. Next question is, can we get examples of how cities and organizations have been able to include residents and neighborhood leaders in this process? I assume the process is the housing element process.
I'd be happy.
I'll
ahead,
let
Mark.
Tom answer. I was actually going to say there's active research right now to follow what cities are doing, but I think it's in play. So Tom, I'll actually, yes, definitely defer to you as to what you are actively doing.
Yes, we have a robust community engagement process, and we work really hard to have a variety of ways for people to be involved and for people to hear about the housing element and to get their views heard, and for us to be able to improve our housing element based on the input we hear from the community. So of course we have all the different housing organizations on our distribution list, and so they know about the housing element and they are invited to comment. And we have a housing policy working group that includes representatives from affordable housing and market rate housing developers and from other housing advocacy organizations, building industry groups, so a variety of stakeholders that are interested in housing development. We have done, in the past, of course, we've done big in-person town hall forums and so forth, but since we're in the era of COVID, we've done a lot of massive online engagements, and we've actually gotten more public involvement through our online engagements than we did when we were doing the in-person ones, because people can do it at their own pace when they would like to. We basically have a kind of a interactive sort of interesting combination of videos and visuals to look at, and then questionnaires that people can fill out so that they can give their opinions about the various issues and proposed policies and approaches that we're presenting in our draft housing element. So we've gotten really good feedback from that. And of course, they're the traditional public hearings as well. But I would never say public hearings are a great way to get public input. I mean, you really want to hear from people while you're drafting the plan, not at the end of the process, just before it's time to get it, adopted. So, but I think we've gotten a lot of input, really good input from experts in the field as well as from average citizens. And interestingly, the single family piece has been the one that has garnered the greatest amount of attention, and there's a growing backlash of people who are unhappy about it and saying that if we allow more units per lot in single family neighborhoods, it will gentrify the neighborhoods, and which I find hilarious, because you're saying basically that neighborhoods that are already gentrified will be gentrified. It's where the homeowners live. It's where the man lives, and yet it's going to be gentrified by renters coming in. So anyway.
Can I just add one
please, Chris.
on the public participation front? So the state law requires cities to solicit input on their housing element from all economic segments of the community. And a city should have a housing element website or some other public place where they explain what kind of public outreach they're doing. And one form of comment that you may submit to HCD, which could be quite effective in getting HCD to take a hard look at the housing element, is that the city's outreach was inadequate. And the only people they heard from were homeowners, or they didn't talk to affordable housing developers, or for that matter, market rate developers. And so I think there are some cities, I will not name names, but there are certainly some cities that are trying not to have a robust public process around their housing element because they're worried about what would be said and that becoming part of the record.
All right, thank you. There's a question here about on the question of single family zoning and eliminating single family zoning, specifically related to ADU and junior ADU legislation. The concept is, didn't that effectively eliminate single family zoning? So I just wonder, reflections from the group on that?
Yes and no. I mean, it does allow more than one unit to be built on a lot. But there are so many specific rules and requirements and criteria attached to what makes an ADU and how much of an ADU you can have and how big and so forth, that it's not the same as saying you can have a duplex, period. That otherwise meets the height and setback and lot coverage, all the other requirements, because all those special strings attached to being an ADU go away. It's just a duplex or a triplex. So one of the interesting challenges we're facing is we recently changed our ADU ordinance to allow 2 ADUs on all of our lots. And so now people are saying, well, if you allow a 4-plex and then you can have 2 ADUs, now you're really talking about 6 units. And so wouldn't that be terrible? And so, we're going to have to face whether we want to roll back our ADU allowance from 2 to 1. And how we address those types of concerns or not. But I think there is a little bit of a difference. But yes, I guess you could say yes in a sense, right? That it's not exclusively only 1 unit per lot now that ADUs are allowed.
Anybody else on the group?
I mean, I think one difference is that a lot of ADUs, it seems, become like yoga studios or home offices. And there's nothing wrong with yoga studios or home offices, but it's not the proportion of ADUs that are actually providing what I would call non-discriminatory housing, housing that's rented to anybody who's willing to pay the rent, is not it's probably not bigger than 50%. Maybe it's even less than that. We'll get better data about this over time. Whereas a developer building fourplexes is going to be selling or renting those units subject to all the fair housing laws and in arm's length transactions. And so I think it provides in that sense, a more accessible form of housing.
Terrific. So it looks like we have a couple more here. So I'm going to give last call to anybody who has any other questions pending. And one here, I'm going to, well, it really addresses downzoning in LA in the 80s or so. We passed Proposition U, which effectively downsoned the city. And Angela Brooks, who I know is an architect, makes this point around floor area ratio and the reduction from 3.1 to 1.5.1. And it's really created an atmosphere where development needs to get discretionary approval. And so effectively slowed down development. It was a very deliberate effort. So I think that the question embedded there is, you know, what can we do to sort of stanch the sort of the slow growth mentality? Is that a generational thing? Are we moving in the right direction, or are we destined to be a state filled with single family big parcels and gigantic commutes and things like that?
I'll jump in. So the city of Sacramento is trying to go in the other direction. We're trying to make sure that we increase the floor area ratios that we allow so that we have a realistic allowance in our, particularly along the commercial corridors and around our transit stations, to make sure that we have an adequate building envelope to accommodate the kind of development that needs to happen there, whether it's affordable housing or mixed use or office or whatever it may be. And we're trying to ensure that our regulations don't trigger unnecessary discretionary reviews. So parking is another key one that comes up. And so we actually have a policy direction to pursue eliminating parking minimums entirely throughout the city and establishing parking maximums, which would probably vary based on proximity to transit stations. So parking is a huge cost issue for all kinds of development, but particularly for affordable housing, I think. And so our current regulations don't require parking near transit stations, and we only require half the normal amount of parking for affordable housing projects. And so, you know, we have some benefits already to reduce the parking requirements, but we want to go even farther.
I would add, I think those are great things for to help spur development and create more density within cities. I would also add that this is another point that making sure that the financing matches up and with the requirements is something that's really critical to increasing density. Oftentimes as developers, we're looking at how do we make our projects feasible, and in some ways the alignment is again misaligned in that if you drop a percentage of units to like a 64 units rather than 100 units that's allowed, then you don't have to do a project labor agreement or things of that nature. I think that if there are incentives that motivate developers to actually push the density rather than to lower it, we would see a lot more affordable housing units get developed as well.
Thanks, Sierra. That notion of leaving units on the table just makes me crazy, right? We
Yeah.
could, but for, right, these other things.
Mhm.
Okay, so one of these, again, from Angie Brooks, that I assume this is the Angie Brooks, but I don't know that for sure. But the kind of an interesting notion, it's sort of a adaptive reuse. So the idea of acquiring a hotel and then trying to make some conversions to it to make it habitable on a permanent basis. And including things that are probably feasible and cost effective, like common area kitchens and bathrooms, but then not being able to get that through the local planning department or building and safety department. I wonder if you guys have either thoughts about that kind of encouraging flexibility among so decision-making agencies and or any examples of places where folks have been doing like, I could also imagine, just as an interjection, as I sit in this office building, which is like seems to be experiencing a decline in tenants, you know, and as we emerge from the pandemic, you know, there's a real question about what does work look like, right? Increasing number of people working at home, and could we be using traditionally commercial spaces as residential areas, and what kinds of things can public agencies do to help facilitate that? Sarah, I saw you pop in on that one, so I'm gonna let you go
Probably
first.
right away. Yeah, so I think this is, you know, again, just aligning everybody's goals. It would be something that would need to be done. Having done rehab on many residential hotels and trying to fit a square peg in a round hole with policy makers specifically, I think that this is when we have that misalignment again, and something that we would need to come to a collective goal and say, this is what we want to get done, and how do we bring everybody to the table to make sure that this could be accomplished, rather than, again, sending the developer on their way to figure out everything and then having to ask for special favors or permission to get things passed, when really it should be everybody's collective goal. If we have empty office buildings, you know, coming out of COVID, and that is definitely something that we're all looking at. And hotels, you know, similarly with the Project Home Key and Room Key, those are things that, you know, they're looking at converting, but trying to take that type of building and convert it into the housing with all the same requirements is really, really difficult. And it does require some waivers. And it really requires bringing everybody to the table and saying, this is the common goal, and what can we do to facilitate that?
Yeah, I think in our zoning, a lot of zones don't allow residential hotels as a by right use. They only allow them as a conditional use, which means you have to apply for a conditional use permit and go through a public hearing process, which can subject the project to a lot of uncertainty and potentially additional time and cost. And so we're actually looking at making changes to increase the number of zones where residential hotels are allowed, as well as residential care facilities, dormitories, and a variety of other housing types or housing adjacent land uses that have traditionally been more restrictively regulated than traditional single family homes and apartments. And I think a lot of that, I mean, my opinion is a lot of that is based on a discriminatory approach that, you know, these uses are viewed as housing undesirables. And so they're going to be restricted with, you know, more difficult zoning provisions. And so we're trying to get away from that, you know, as we're promoting our goals of inclusion and meeting the needs of all segments of our population.
All right, now I'm battling content and time. There's actually a really interesting question here about or a statement that says the ADUs don't need to meet accessibility standards. Is that true? That's news to me. It doesn't mean I should have known. Anybody know? So that we'll accept that Patty Prumhuber knows. All right, so the final question of the day, and then the last thing for each of the panelists, I'm going to give you an opportunity to make a closing, very short closing statement. Think 20, 30 seconds as opposed to minutes. This last point is in addition, this is talking about, Tom, your commentary about gentrification in single family neighborhoods, if you do ADUs and other things. In addition, neighborhoods being gentrified, some opponents say that it will bring increased crime, and that it's bad for the environment. Can you speak to that? But before you guys respond, I'll just say that we just developed a piece that's infographic about sort of debunking myths about housing affordability, and then we'll make sure that we affordable housing, and we'll make sure that we include that in the information that goes out today. But do you have folks have thoughts about kind of the narrative that density increases crime and is bad for the environment?
Yeah, I think most people probably have been renters at one point or another in their lives. Even the homeowners that often make these allegations. And so, maybe they're thinking of themselves. I'm not sure, but I don't believe it's true that renters in general, and certainly I think there are studies that show that residents of low-income housing developments in particular aren't necessarily more inclined to commit crimes or cause those types of neighborhood problems. As far as the environment's concerned, I mean, I did make a point in my slideshow to talk about the environmental benefits of reducing commute links, having people be able to live closer to where the existing schools and parks and shopping opportunities are, and to take advantage of the existing infrastructure. So actually, it's better for the environment than pushing that housing out to the suburban fringes.
Could I jump in briefly? So there's actually an amazing body of research now, some based on housing voucher programs with random assignment of vouchers, some based on economic shocks and dislocations that cause people to move at different times from one location to another. And poor children who grow up in middle-class neighborhoods have much better outcomes by almost any measure, whether that's future criminal activity, whether that's lifespan, whether that's educational attainment, whether that's income. I mean, the effects of neighborhood conditions on the life outcomes of poor kids are demonstrable and very large. So the notion that we should keep poor people from moving into middle-class neighborhoods as a way of containing crime has things 100% backwards, right? If you want to reduce crime over time, you need to provide access to middle-class neighborhoods for disadvantaged families.
Terrific, thank you. With apologies to those of you whose questions are sort of outstanding, I would actually refer the panel to those last two questions by Ruth and an anonymous attendee. And then there's one that just came in real quick, Chris, around this idea of outcomes and high opportunity neighborhoods. So if you had any links to resources on that, it'd be great. So last word. So we've managed to use almost all the time. So I'm going to take you from 30 seconds to like 20 something. And Moira, we're going to start with you.
Okay, my last word is, in terms of the research I'm engaged in and what I am at this moment excited about, is I think we have quite a bit of law on the books right now that can address many of the issues that we've talked about today. I think the white paper that it was the catalyst for that illustrates that. And what I would love to see is increasing data and transparency around what's happening at the local level to regulate development, so that we can see the transitions that we've talked about today in terms of zoning and planning.
Terrific, thank you so much. And while Chris is just cranking out a litany of references of great news, thank you so much. I'm going to go to Tom.
All politics is local, so if you don't have a local political environment that supports a pro-housing philosophy, then it may require bringing in outside pressures. And there are housing advocacy groups that have been suing some of these exclusionary cities in the Bay Area over these types of issues, failing to provide adequate land or failing to approve housing projects that should have been approved under state law.
Tip O'Neill has been has emerged again. He's in Sacramento, apparently. Chris.
Yeah, I just added one more link to the chat for the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements, which is a coalition of groups that have organized to advocate around housing elements. I've given some advice to them. And if you're looking for a way to get involved and monitor what cities are doing, that's one productive outlet.
Terrific, thank you so much. And before we close out, just as a heads up to the SCAMP staff, now that I understand it doesn't save chat, but it saves Q&A, can we just make sure that we capture all those references and make sure it goes back out to everybody? That'd be great. And then since it is SCAMP membership month, just one of the added benefits of membership is that if you're a member and you're part of a workshop, you get the closing words. So Sierra, I'll bring that to you.
Well, I would just say, it's all about getting involved and educating, over and over again. I think through education, if we can educate constituents, if we can educate our neighbors, if we can educate everyone on the need for affordable housing and all of the obstacles that we face, I think it's something that we can collectively make change.
Fantastic. Sierra Adelano, Tom Pace, Chris Elmendorf, Moira O'Neill. Thanks everybody for your terrific commentary today. Y'all are a bunch of really smart folks, and we're all better off for this experience. And thanks everybody who attended today. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank